morning sun broke across the Montana Territory like a promise that would never be kept, casting long golden shadows over the Mercer Ranch where 13-year-old Evangeline stood in the yard with a basket of chicken feed pressed against her hip, her bare feet dusty and her copper-colored hair catching the early light as she scattered grain for the hens and hummed a melody her mother used to sing before the fever took her 2 winters past. She didn't know yet that this would be the last morning she would ever stand in this yard as a free child. Didn't know that in less than an hour her father would sell her like livestock to pay a debt that had been growing like a cancer in his soul. Didn't know that the 3 dark shapes appearing on the eastern horizon were riding toward her with a transaction already decided and a future already written in the cold mathematics of men who measured human worth in silver coins. The chickens clucked and pecked around her ankles, oblivious to the way her father, Silas Mercer, stood on the sagging porch with his shoulders hunched and his hands trembling as he watched those riders approach, his face carrying the hollow look of a man who had already made the devil's bargain and was now waiting for the devil to collect. Inside the small ranch house that had once echoed with her mother's laughter but now held only the sound of her 8-year-old brother Tommy's feverish breathing, Eva had spent the early hours of dawn wiping his forehead with cool water and whispering stories about the future they would have when things got better, when the ranch started making money again, when their father stopped disappearing into redemption flats and coming home smelling like whiskey and desperation. She had dreams that lived in the careful letters she practiced writing in the dirt behind the barn. Dreams of becoming a school teacher like Miss Caroline in town who wore pressed dresses and spoke with authority about books and mathematics and the wide world beyond the Montana dust. Dreams that felt as real and solid as the morning sun, even though they were built on the crumbling foundation of a failing ranch and a father who had stopped believing in anything except the bottom of a bottle and the false promise of the next card game. Tommy had smiled at her stories that morning despite the fever making his small body shake, had whispered that when he got better he would help her build a schoolhouse, and she had kissed his burning forehead and told him to rest while she went to do the morning chores, never imagining that by nightfall she would be miles away from him, and he would be crying her name into the darkness. The 3 riders came slowly, deliberately, like men who knew that fear worked better when it had time to build, and Eva watched them from the corner of her eye while pretending to focus on the chickens, her child's instinct sensing danger in the way her father straightened his spine and wiped his palms on his worn trousers. The man in the center rode a massive black horse and wore a coat that probably cost more than everything the Mercers owned combined, his face hard and clean-shaven in a way that spoke of money and power and the kind of cruelty that came dressed in respectability. And Eva knew without being told that this was Thornton Blackwell, the cattle baron who owned half the territory and wanted the other half. Flanking him were 2 other men, one dressed like a lawyer or accountant with spectacles and a ledger book, the other lean and dangerous-looking with a tied-down revolver and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw, measuring distances and calculating threats with the automatic precision of a man who made his living through violence. And this was Virgil Cross, though Eva didn't know his name yet, didn't know that he would become both her jailer and eventually her unlikely savior. Her father called her name, his voice cracking on the second syllable in a way that made her stomach twist with sudden terrible knowing, and she set down the basket and walked toward the porch with her head high despite the fear crawling up her spine like ice water, her bare feet leaving small prints in the dust that the wind would erase before sunset. Silas Mercer looked at his daughter with eyes that couldn't quite meet hers, his face a battlefield of shame and desperation, and the hollow justification of a man who had convinced himself that what he was about to do was necessity rather than betrayal. And he opened his mouth twice before the words finally came out in a hoarse whisper that told her to go inside, to wait in her room, to be a good girl just this once and do what she was told. but Ava had inherited her mother's stubborn spine along with her copper hair. And something in the way these men sat their horses with the satisfied patience of creditors come to collect made her plant her feet and refuse to move, made her stare at her father with questions burning in her green eyes until he finally broke and turned away, gesturing weakly toward the men as if introducing them at a church social rather than a transaction that would destroy what remained of his daughter's childhood. Thornton Blackwell dismounted with the casual authority of a man who owned everything he touched, his boots hitting the ground with solid thuds that seemed to echo with finality. And he looked at Ava with the same appraising expression she had seen men use when evaluating horses at the stock auction in town. His gaze traveling from her tangled hair to her thin dress to her dusty feet with a calculation that made her want to run and hide and scrub herself clean all at once. He spoke to her father while looking at her, his voice smooth and educated and absolutely devoid of warmth, asking if this was the girl, commenting on her age and appearance with clinical detachment, mentioning that his son Clayton had very specific requirements for a wife, and that young was preferable because it meant she could be properly molded and trained to understand her duties and obligations. Eva felt the words wash over her like cold water, not quite understanding at first because surely he couldn't mean what it sounded like he meant. Surely her father couldn't. But then Silas was nodding and his hands were shaking harder and he was saying something about the debt being $500 and about Tommy being sick and about having no other choice, no other way. The man with the ledger book opened it with a crisp snap of pages and read aloud the accounting of Silas Mercer's destruction. The card games lost, the loans taken, the interest compounded, the extensions granted and now called due. Each number another nail in the coffin of their family. And Eva listened with growing horror as the total climbed higher and higher until it reached a sum that might as well have been $1 million for all the chance her father had of paying it. Blackwell let the silence stretch after the accounting finished, let the weight of that impossible debt press down on them all, and then he made his offer with the casualness of a man discussing the weather, stating that he would forgive the entire debt in exchange for Eva becoming his son's wife, that she would live at the Blackwell Ranch with all the comfort and security that their wealth could provide, that it was really quite generous when one considered the alternatives, which he didn't need to specify because the threat of foreclosure and homelessness and watching Tommy die for lack of medicine hung in the air like smoke. Eva found her voice then, found it deep in her chest where her mother's strength lived in memory, and she screamed at her father that she was too young to be a wife, that she didn't even know this Clayton person, that she had plans and dreams and a whole life ahead of her that didn't involve being sold like a piece of property to strangers. Her words came out raw and desperate and edged with tears, but Silas couldn't look at her, could only stare at the ground while his shoulders shook and his mouth worked soundlessly around justifications that wouldn't come. And finally he whispered that she would have a roof over her head and food in her belly, and Tommy would get the medicine he needed, and maybe this was God's way of providing for them all, though the words sounded hollow even as he spoke them. Virgil Cross, the dangerous man with the tied-down gun, shifted in his saddle and looked away toward the horizon, his jaw tight and his eyes carrying something that might have been discomfort or regret. But he said nothing, did nothing, remained as still and silent as a man could be while watching a child's world shatter into pieces. The transaction concluded with terrible swiftness after that, Blackwell producing a leather pouch that clinked with the weight of silver coins and counting them out into Silas Mercer's palm, while Eva stood frozen and disbelieving, watching her worth being measured in cold metal. 30 pieces of silver for a girl who still practiced her letters in the dirt and dreamed of teaching school. Her father's fingers closed around the coins with a desperate greed that made her stomach turn, and she understood in that moment that she had already lost him to whatever demons had been eating him alive since her mother died, that the man who once carried her on his shoulders and called her his little songbird was gone, and in his place stood this hollow shell, who could trade his daughter's future for temporary relief from his failures. Blackwell told her to pack her things, to say goodbye to her brother, to be ready to leave within the hour. And Ava stumbled into the house on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, her mind reeling with the impossibility of what was happening, the unreality of being told at 13 years old that her childhood was over and her life now belonged to a stranger who wanted a wife young enough to mold. Tommy was sitting up in bed when she entered their shared room, his fever-bright eyes wide with questions, and Ava tried to smile for him, even as tears streamed down her face, tried to explain in words a child could understand that she was going away for a while to help the family, that he needed to get better and be strong, that she would always love him no matter what happened or how far apart they were. He cried and clung to her thin arms with surprising strength, begging her not to go, saying he didn't care about medicine or money if it meant losing his sister. But she gently pried his fingers loose and pressed her mother's locket into his palm, the only valuable thing they owned, and told him to keep it safe until they saw each other again. She packed her few belongings into a cloth bundle with hands that shook so badly she could barely tie the knot. A spare dress, her mother's brush, the slate she used for writing practice, the rag doll she had slept with since she was small, pathetic possessions for a girl whose entire world fit into a bundle small enough to carry in one arm. And when she walked back outside into the merciless sunlight, she felt like she was walking to her own execution. Virgil Cross was the one who lifted her onto the horse, his hands careful and impersonal. And Ava noticed that he still wouldn't meet her eyes, noticed the muscle jumping in his jaw and the way his fingers trembled just slightly before he stepped back and mounted his own horse. She looked back at the ranch house one final time and saw Tommy's small face pressed against the window glass, his mouth open in a wail she couldn't hear over the sound of hoofbeats beginning to move. Saw her father standing on the porch with the pouch of coins clutched against his chest and his head bowed like a man at a funeral. And she understood with terrible clarity that this was a kind of death, that the Eva who scattered chicken feed and dreamed of teaching school was dying right here in this dusty yard, and whatever she became after this moment would be shaped by men who saw her as property rather than a person. The horses carried her away from everything she had ever known, away from her brother's fever-bright eyes and her mother's grave on the hill. And the letters she had practiced in the dirt carried her toward the Blackwell Ranch and a man named Clayton who wanted a wife young enough to train. And as the distance grew between her and home, Eva made herself a promise that lived like steel in her chest, a promise that no matter what they did to her or how they tried to break her, she would survive this. She would find a way to be more than what they intended. She would become something they never expected, though she had no idea yet what form that survival would take or what price it would demand from her soul. The ride stretched ahead of them like a road to nowhere, the Montana landscape beautiful and indifferent under the climbing sun. And Ava sat rigid on the horse with her small bundle clutched against her chest and her eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to cry anymore, refusing to give these men the satisfaction of seeing her fear, holding on to the last shreds of her dignity like a drowning person holds on to driftwood. And behind her the dust rose from the horse's hooves and obscured the ranch until it disappeared completely, leaving her suspended between a past that had betrayed her and a future that waited like an open mouth to swallow her whole. The Blackwell Ranch emerged from the Montana plains like a monument to greed and ambition, its main house rising 3 stories tall with white-painted columns that seemed obscene in their grandeur against the backdrop of rough frontier country, surrounded by bunkhouses and barns that could have sheltered entire families, but instead housed the small army of ranch hands and servants required to maintain Thornton Blackwell's empire of cattle and cruelty. Eva had never seen anything like it in her 13 years of life, had never imagined that such wealth could exist in the same world as her family's failing homestead with its sagging porch and patched roof. And the sight of it filled her with a despair so profound it felt like drowning. Because she understood instinctively that a man who built a palace in the wilderness was a man who believed himself above the laws that governed ordinary people. A man who took what he wanted and called it his right. The horses carried them through an ornate iron gate that probably cost more than her father's entire debt, past manicured gardens that seemed like a cruel joke in this land of dust and struggle, and up a curved drive where servants in actual uniforms waited to take the horses, their faces carefully blank as they watched Virgil Cross lift Eva down from the saddle with hands that still trembled with something that might have been shame. She was brought into the main house through massive double doors that opened into a foyer larger than her entire former home. The floors polished to a mirror shine, and the walls hung with paintings of stern-faced Blackwell ancestors who seemed to judge her poverty and dirt-streaked face from their gilded frames, and Eva clutched her pathetic cloth bundle tighter against her chest as if it could shield her from the overwhelming wrongness of this place. Thornton Blackwell strode ahead of them with the confidence of a king in his castle, calling out orders to servants who materialized from doorways like ghosts, directing that the girl be taken upstairs and cleaned up and dressed in something appropriate because his son would want to meet her before dinner. And first impressions mattered even in arrangements such as these. An elderly woman appeared at Eva's elbow, her face lined with years and carrying an expression of deep sadness that spoke of things witnessed and endured, introducing herself as Martha, the head housekeeper, in a voice barely above a whisper. And she took Eva's hand with surprising gentleness and led her up a curved staircase that seemed to climb forever toward a second floor filled with more rooms than Eva could count. The bedroom where Martha brought her was larger than the entire living space of the Mercer ranch house, furnished with a canopied bed draped in fabric that shimmered like water, and a wardrobe that stood taller than a man, and a dressing table with a mirror so large and perfect that Eva barely recognized her own reflection in it. Her copper hair wild and tangled, her face streaked with dust and dried tears, her eyes carrying a haunted look that made her seem older than her years. Martha drew a bath in an actual porcelain tub with water heated in the kitchen and carried up by silent servants, and Eva sat in the steaming water feeling like she was being prepared for some terrible ritual, scrubbing away the dust of her old life while Martha laid out a dress of deep blue silk that must have belonged to someone else because it certainly wasn't made for a dirt-poor rancher's daughter. The old housekeeper worked in silence for a long time, her weathered hands surprisingly gentle as she helped Eva wash and dry and dress. But finally she spoke in a voice so low it was almost lost in the rustle of fabric, telling Eva that she needed to be very careful here, that the Blackwell men were not kind to those they considered beneath them, that there had been another girl brought to this house 2 years ago under similar circumstances, and that girl had tried to run away and been found 3 days later in the canyon with a broken neck that everyone called an accident, though the servants knew better. Eva felt ice water flood her veins at these words, felt the last hope she had been clinging to shatter like glass against stone, and she asked Martha in a voice that shook why she was telling her this if there was no escape. Why bother warning her if the outcome was already written? The old woman's hands stilled on the buttons of Eva's dress, and her eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with intelligence, met Eva's in the mirror, and she said that not everyone in this house agreed with what Thornton Blackwell did, that there were people here who still remembered what it meant to have a conscience, that knowledge was power even when power seemed impossible. And then she pressed something small and cold into Eva's palm, a key that she said opened the door to the servants' staircase at the end of the hall. just in case Ava ever needed another way out of her room besides the main door that would certainly be watched. The gesture was small and probably futile, but it represented the first kindness Ava had received since leaving her home, and she closed her fingers around that key like it was a lifeline, even though she knew that locked doors and secret staircases wouldn't save her from men who owned everything and everyone for miles in every direction. The afternoon stretched into evening with Ava locked in that beautiful prison of a bedroom, the key turning in the lock from the outside with a click that sounded like the closing of a coffin, and she paced the room like a caged animal, examining the windows that looked out over a drop too high to survive and the walls too thick to hear through and the door too solid to break down with her small girl's strength. She thought about Tommy sick with fever and counting on the medicine her sacrifice would buy. Thought about her father clutching those silver coins like they could redeem him from what he'd done. Thought about her mother's grave on the hill above their ranch and wondered what she would think of the daughter she'd left behind being sold like livestock to pay for a man's weakness and stupidity. The anger that had been building since morning finally broke through the shock and fear, burning hot and clean in her chest. And Ava made herself a promise that even if she couldn't escape physically, she would not let them break her spirit, would not become the docile, obedient thing they wanted her to be, would hold on to herself and her dreams even if those dreams had to be hidden so deep inside that no one else could see them. As the sun began to set and paint the Montana sky in shades of blood and fire, Ava heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room, heavy boots that stopped at her door. And then the key turned and the door swung open to reveal a man who could only be Clayton Blackwell, 29 years old and carrying his father's entitled arrogance like a second skin, his eyes traveling over her with an expression that made her skin crawl because it wasn't desire or even interest, but rather the satisfaction of a man inspecting property he'd just acquired. He stepped into the room without invitation and closed the door behind him, moving with the casual confidence of someone who had never been denied anything in his entire life. And he told Ava that she cleaned up nicely, that the dress suited her, that she would do very well once she learned her place and understood what was expected of a Blackwell wife. His voice carried a condescension that set her teeth on edge, speaking to her the way someone might speak to a slightly dim child or a dog being trained for tricks. And he circled her slowly while talking about the wedding that would take place in 3 days, about the duties she would perform as his wife in language that made her want to vomit, about how lucky she was to be rescued from poverty and given the opportunity to serve a family of such standing and importance. Ava stood frozen under his inspection, her hands clenched into fists in the folds of her silk dress, her jaw tight with the effort of not screaming or crying or launching herself at him with nails and teeth. And she forced herself to meet his eyes with a defiance that clearly surprised him because he was used to fear and submission from those he considered inferior. Clayton's expression hardened at her stare and he moved closer, invading the space around her until she could smell the pomade in his hair and the whiskey on his breath. And he told her in a voice gone cold and threatening that defiance was something he would enjoy breaking out of her, that training a wife was much more satisfying when she started with spirit, because the process of crushing that spirit was half the pleasure. He reached out and grabbed her chin with fingers that bit into her skin, forcing her head up at an uncomfortable angle. And he informed her that she belonged to him now just as surely as the horse in his stable or the dog at his feet, that her father's signature on the contract made her his property in every way that mattered, that she would learn to call him master and mean it, or she would learn what happened to property that didn't serve its purpose. When Clayton finally left and locked the door behind him, Eva collapsed onto the floor with her back against the bed, her whole body shaking with rage and terror and the horrible understanding that this was worse than she had imagined, that this wasn't just an unwanted marriage but a form of ownership that reduced her to an object without rights or will or humanity. She sat there in the darkening room as the last light faded from the windows and tried to think, tried to plan, tried to find some way out of this nightmare that didn't end with her broken body at the bottom of a canyon like the girl who had come before her. The house settled into night sounds around her, creaking timbers and distant voices and the wind that rattled the windows like it was trying to get in. And Ava pulled herself up off the floor and moved to the window to stare out at the Montana darkness that stretched forever in all directions. Beautiful and indifferent and absolutely unforgiving to those who tried to cross it unprepared. She was still standing there when she heard voices rising in argument from somewhere below her window, male voices sharp with anger. And she pressed her face to the glass, trying to make out the words that drifted up through the night air. One voice belonged to Thornton Blackwell, cold and imperious, speaking about property and contracts and arrangements that were none of anyone else's concern, and the other voice, rough with emotion and edged with something that might have been disgust, belonged to Virgil Cross, and Ava heard him say words that cut through the darkness like a knife. "She's a child, Thornton, 13 years old, and you're selling her to your son like she's livestock. There's got to be a line somewhere even for men like us." The response came swift and brutal, Thornton's voice dropping to a register that promised violence, informing Cross that he was paid to enforce, not to question. That if he had a problem with how the Blackwell family conducted their business, he was welcome to leave and forfeit the wages he was owed and the security of his position. That there were plenty of men who would take his place and do what they were told without developing a conscience at the most inconvenient moment possible. The silence that followed stretched so long Ava thought the conversation was over. But then she heard Cross speak again, his voice carrying a weariness that spoke of battles fought and lost against his own complicity, saying that he would stay and do his job, but that he wanted it on record that he thought this was wrong, that taking a child and calling it marriage was just slavery by another name. And Thornton laughed, actually laughed, a sound devoid of humor that made Ava's blood run cold as he replied that morality was a luxury afforded only to those who could pay for it, and that Cross had sold his moral high ground the first time he'd taken Blackwell money to do Blackwell work. The voices faded after that, footsteps retreating into the house, and Ava stood at the window with her heart racing and her mind spinning because she had just heard the first crack in the armor of the men who held her captive. Had just learned that Virgil Cross, the dangerous man with the tied-down gun and the eyes that wouldn't meet hers, carried guilt about what he had done and might, just might, be someone whose conscience could be leveraged into action. The night deepened around her, and Ava moved away from the window to sit on the edge of the enormous bed, her mind working through possibilities and probabilities, calculating risks the way she had seen her father calculate odds at the card table before his gambling destroyed them all. She couldn't escape alone. That much was clear from Martha's warning about the girl in the canyon, and from the sheer isolation of this ranch with its miles of empty country in every direction. But maybe she didn't have to escape alone. Maybe there was a way to turn Cross's obvious conflict into an alliance, to appeal to whatever humanity still existed in a man who had argued against her captivity even knowing it would cost him. The plan was desperate and probably doomed to failure, but it was the only plan she had. And as Ava finally lay down on the silk sheets of a bed that felt like a coffin, she made herself another promise, that tomorrow she would find a way to speak to Virgil Cross alone, would find a way to plant the seed of rebellion in the guilty soil of his conscience, would find a way to convince him that saving her might also be a way to save whatever remained of his own soul. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and filled with nightmares of Clayton's hands and her father's cowardice and the endless Montana wilderness swallowing her whole. But when Ava woke to the gray light of dawn filtering through the curtains, she woke with purpose burning in her chest, with the determination of a girl who had been sold but refused to be broken, with a plan that was equal parts courage and desperation, and the kind of hope that only exists in those who have absolutely nothing left to lose. And she rose from that bed knowing that today would determine whether she remained a victim or became something else entirely, whether she would accept the fate that had been forced upon her or fight for the right to write her own ending. And as she heard the key turning in the lock and Martha entering with breakfast and clothes for the day, Eva steeled herself for the most important performance of her young life, the performance that would either convince Virgil Cross to help her escape or seal her doom forever in this beautiful prison where girls were bought and sold and broken and buried in canyons where no one would ever find them. The dawn arrived cold and unforgiving on the third day of Eva's captivity, the morning that was supposed to transform her from a 13-year-old child into Clayton Blackwell's property, through the mockery of a wedding ceremony. But Eva had not spent these 3 days waiting passively for her fate to be sealed, had instead watched and learned and waited for the moment when Virgil Cross would be alone and vulnerable to the appeal she had been rehearsing in her mind. With the desperate focus of someone whose life depended on getting every word exactly right. That moment came in the gray light before sunrise when she heard his boots in the hallway outside her room, heard him walking past on his way to the stables for the morning patrol that Martha had told her was his habit. And Eva used the key the old housekeeper had given her to slip out through the servants' staircase and follow him through the sleeping house and out into the cold Montana morning where the world was still painted in shades of shadow and possibility. She caught up to him at the stable doors where he stood with his hand on the weathered wood, his shoulders hunched against more than just the morning chill. And when she spoke his name in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, he spun around with his hand dropping instinctively to his gun before recognition stopped him. And something like pain crossed his face at the sight of her standing there in her nightdress and bare feet, with her copper hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes burning with a desperate determination that made her look both younger and older than her years. Eva didn't give him time to send her back inside or call for help. Didn't give him time to rebuild whatever walls he used to separate his conscience from his actions, but instead launched into the speech she had been perfecting for 3 days. Her words tumbling out in a torrent of emotion and logic and appeal to whatever humanity still existed in the man who had carried her away from her home. She told him that she knew he thought this was wrong, that she had heard him arguing with Thornton Blackwell about her age and her circumstances, that she had seen the way he couldn't look at her on the ride to this prison of a ranch because looking at her would mean confronting what he was complicit in. And she asked him point blank if he had a daughter, if he had someone somewhere in the world who he loved the way fathers were supposed to love their children, someone whose face he saw when he looked at her and whose innocence made his participation in her destruction unbearable. Cross's face went through a series of expressions that Eva catalogued like a gambler reading tells at a card table: denial and anger and grief, and finally a kind of resignation that told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke. And when he did speak, his voice was rough with emotion he had been trying to suppress for days, admitting that yes, he had a daughter back in St. Louis, a girl about Eva's age named Sarah who he hadn't seen in 5 years. Because he had made choices that put money and survival ahead of principles and family, and by the time he realized what he had become, it was too late to go back. The confession hung between them in the cold morning air like a bridge that Eva knew she had to cross before it collapsed, and she took a step closer to him, her bare feet freezing in the dirt, but her voice steady with the conviction of someone who had already decided that death was preferable to what awaited her in that house. And she told him that it wasn't too late, that every moment offered a choice between the person you had been and the person you could still become, that helping her escape could be the first step toward becoming someone who could look his daughter in the eye again without shame eating him alive from the inside. She saw him wavering, saw the battle playing out across his features as years of compromises and rationalizations warred against the simple truth that what was happening to her was wrong in a way that transcended contracts and debts and the complicated mathematics men used to justify their cruelty. And she pressed her advantage with the ruthless instinct of someone who knew this was her only chance, telling him that when he finally went back to St. Louis and held his Sarah in his arms again, he would have to carry the weight of either saving a girl just like her or standing by while that girl was destroyed, and she asked him which version of himself he wanted to be. The silence stretched between them while the sun began to paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Ava watched Virgil cross his face as something fundamental shifted in his expression. Some final wall crumbling to reveal the man he had been before Thornton Blackwell's money had corrupted him into someone he barely recognized in the mirror. He told her in a voice barely above a whisper that if they did this, it would mean burning every bridge he had, that Blackwell would hunt them both across the territory and beyond, that she needed to understand the stakes before he threw away everything he had built in this life, however compromised and ugly that life had become. And Ava laughed then, a sound without humor that carried all the bitterness of 3 days in captivity. And she told him that she had no bridges left to burn, that her father had already sold her future for silver coins, that she would rather die free in the Montana wilderness than live another day as property in a gilded cage. Cross looked at her for a long moment with something like respect growing in his eyes, and then he nodded once, sharp and decisive, and told her to go back to her room and wait, that he would prepare horses and supplies and they would leave before the house woke fully, that she should bring nothing that couldn't fit in a saddlebag because they would need to ride hard and fast once Blackwell discovered what they had done. The next hours passed with agonizing slowness as Eva returned to her room and dressed in the most practical clothes she could find in the wardrobe, her hands shaking with a combination of fear and hope, and the terrible uncertainty that came with staking everything on the word of a man who had already betrayed her once by bringing her here. Martha appeared with breakfast and found Ava fully dressed and pacing like a caged animal, and the old housekeeper's eyes went wide with understanding before a small smile crossed her weathered face, and she pressed a cloth bundle into Ava's hands containing bread and dried meat and a canteen of water, whispering that she had lost her own daughter to men like the Blackwells 20 years ago, and that every day since she had prayed for the chance to save just one girl from the same fate. The moment came just after dawn when Ava heard a soft whistle from the courtyard below her window, and she used Martha's key one last time to slip down the servants' staircase and out through the kitchen where the old woman stood guard. And then she was running across the courtyard to where Cross waited with 2 horses already saddled and provisioned, his face grim but determined as he lifted her onto the smaller mare and swung himself onto his own mount with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. They had perhaps an hour's head start before one of the servants would discover Ava's empty room and raise the alarm. Perhaps 2 hours before Thornton Blackwell would organize a pursuit with Clayton and the ranch hands who were loyal to the family's money if not their methods, and Cross pushed them hard across the open country toward the north in the town of Helena, where the territorial marshal had jurisdiction beyond Blackwell's reach. The Montana landscape flew past them in a blur of grassland and rolling hills, the horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth, in a rhythm that sounded like freedom or maybe just desperation, and Ava clung to her mount with her copper hair streaming behind her and her heart pounding with equal parts terror and exhilaration, because for the first time in 3 days, she was moving toward something instead of being dragged away from everything she knew. They rode through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping only once to water the horses at a stream where Cross taught Eva how to reload his spare revolver because he said they would need every gun they could get if Blackwell caught up to them. And Eva's hands learned the weight of the weapon and the mechanical precision of loading chambers with bullets that might soon be used to defend her life or end someone else's. The pursuit found them just as the sun began its descent toward evening, a line of riders appearing on the horizon behind them like dark prophecies of violence. And Cross cursed and urged the horses faster, even though Eva could see that her mare was already laboring with exhaustion. They made it to a river crossing swollen with snowmelt from the mountains, the water running fast and dangerous and representing both obstacle and opportunity. And Cross was calculating their chances of making it across when the first shot cracked through the air and sent up a spray of water near the horse's feet. Eva looked back and saw Clayton Blackwell at the head of the pursuit, his face twisted with rage at the theft of his property. And beside him rode his father and 6 ranch hands armed with rifles, and Cross told her in a voice that brooked no argument that she needed to cross the river now, that he would hold them here long enough for her to get to the other side and make for the stand of trees a mile distant where she could hide until he either joined her or didn't. Eva refused, her voice rising with the same defiance she had shown Clayton in that bedroom, telling Cross that she hadn't convinced him to help her just so he could die buying her a few extra minutes, that they would stand together or fall together because that's what it meant to choose redemption over compromise. The standoff at the river crossing became the crucible where everything that came before was distilled into a single moment of choice. Cross and Eva on one side with the rushing water at their backs, the Blackwells and their hired guns on the other with murder in their eyes and the absolute conviction that their money gave them the right to take what they wanted. Clayton was shouting something about Eva being his lawful property, about having a contract that bound her to him regardless of her wishes, and Cross shouted back that some contracts weren't worth the paper they were written on, that selling children wasn't marriage but slavery. And Thornton Blackwell's response was to raise his rifle and fire, the bullet meant for Cross but going wide in the fading light and the chaos of horses milling nervously at the water's edge. What happened next seemed to unfold in the strange, slow motion that accompanies moments when history pivots on decisions made in the space between heartbeats. Clayton raising his own rifle and sighting down the barrel at Cross, his finger tightening on the trigger. But at that instant his horse shied sideways from the noise and motion and the shot went wild, the bullet striking not Cross but Thornton Blackwell in the shoulder, spinning the old man backward off his horse to land in the dirt with blood spreading across his expensive coat. The chaos that erupted in the wake of that accidental shooting gave Eva and Cross the opening they needed, the ranch hands suddenly more concerned with their fallen employer than with continuing the pursuit. And Clayton's face went from rage to horror as he realized he had shot his own father. And in that moment of confusion and shouting and horses rearing in panic, Eva and Cross drove their mounts into the river and fought their way across the current that tried to drag them downstream. They made the far bank with water streaming from their clothes and the horses gasping with exhaustion, and when Eva looked back she saw that no one was following, saw Clayton dismounted and bent over his father's body while the ranch hands clustered around them, saw one of them stand and shake his head as if refusing to continue this hunt. And she understood that Thornton Blackwell's injury had broken whatever spell of fear and greed had kept these men loyal to a cause they probably never believed in. Cross and Eva didn't stop to watch the resolution of that tableau, but instead urged their exhausted horses toward the tree line, and then beyond, riding through the dusk and into the full dark of night until they saw the lights of Helena spread out in the valley below them like a constellation of hope and civilization, and the promise that the rule of law still meant something beyond Blackwell's reach. The weeks that followed Eva's arrival in Helena passed in a blur of testimony and investigations, and the slow grinding wheels of territorial justice, Eva telling her story to Marshal Davies with Cross standing beside her corroborating every word, and the marshal's face growing darker with anger as he learned the details of what Thornton Blackwell had done under the pretense of legal contracts and business arrangements. The news that filtered back from the Blackwell ranch told them that Thornton had survived his son's bullet, but that the injury and the scandal had broken his power. That ranch hands were leaving his employment and creditors were calling in debts, and the house of cards built on cruelty and intimidation was finally collapsing under its own corrupt weight. Clayton faced charges for attempted kidnapping and for the assault on his father, and Silas Mercer was brought to Helena with Tommy to face Ava in a room at the marshal's office. And when her father tried to apologize with tears streaming down his face and his hands reaching toward her, Ava stepped back and held up her hand in a gesture that was both forgiveness and final separation. She told him that she would make sure Tommy was cared for, that she would see to it her brother got the medicine and education and future he deserved, but that she could never go back to being his daughter because he had stopped being her father the moment he counted those silver coins in his palm. And Silas Mercer nodded with his face collapsing into grief, because he understood that some betrayals cut too deep to ever truly heal. Eva found a home with Catherine Chen, a Chinese woman who ran a boarding house and teaching school in Helena, and who saw in this fierce copper-haired girl the same determination she had needed to survive in a country that didn't always welcome her. And under Catherine's guidance, Eva began to rebuild herself from the ruins of what the Blackwells had tried to make her. She studied with an intensity that burned away the nightmares, learning mathematics and literature and history with the hunger of someone reclaiming a future that had been stolen. And she made sure Tommy came to live in Helena, where she could watch over him as he grew stronger and healthier than he had been in years. Virgil Cross stayed in town too, finding work as a deputy marshal and beginning the long process of writing letters to his daughter in St. Louis. Letters that tried to explain and apologize and invite her to come west to meet the man he was trying to become rather than the man he had been. And sometimes Ava would see him on the street and they would nod to each other with the understanding of people who had stood together at the edge of an abyss and chosen to pull each other back from the brink. On the first anniversary of the day she had been sold by her father and saved by her own courage and a guilty man's redemption, Ava stood on the porch of Catherine's boarding house with a book in her hands, and the Montana sunset painting the sky in colors that reminded her of both endings and beginnings. And she thought about the girl she had been who scattered chicken feed in a dusty yard and dreamed of becoming a teacher, and about the girl she had become who had stared down men who wanted to break her and had refused to let them define who she would be. She was 14 now. Still too young for so many things, but old enough to understand that survival was sometimes its own form of victory, that the future she was building with her own hands from the shattered pieces of her stolen childhood was more precious than any future that had been handed to her could ever be. The book in her hands was a primer she was using to teach other girls in town who wanted to learn, girls whose families were too poor or too scattered to send them to proper schools. And Ava found that teaching gave her a purpose that transcended her own pain and turned her suffering into something that could light the way for others who walked similar paths through darkness. The West remained wild and dangerous and full of men who believed their strength or wealth gave them the right to take what they wanted. But Ava had learned that it also held space for those who refused to accept the roles others tried to force upon them, that the same wilderness that could kill the unprepared could also offer sanctuary to those brave enough to claim it. And she stood on that porch with the sunset fading into twilight and the first stars beginning to appear in the vast Montana sky. No longer the child who had been sold to pay a debt she didn't owe, but not yet the woman she would become. Suspended in that liminal space where trauma transforms into strength and survival becomes the foundation for something like triumph. They had tried to make her a wife when she was just a child, had tried to reduce her to property and break her spirit and steal her future. But Ava Mercer had discovered something they never expected, had learned that the human soul when pressed to its limits can become either brittle and shattered, or forged into something harder than the cruelty that tried to destroy it. And she had chosen the latter. had chosen to become a survivor and a teacher, and eventually a woman who would spend her life making sure that no other girl would have to stand where she had stood or make the choices she had been forced to make. And as the darkness settled over Helena and the lights began to glow in windows across the town, Eva opened her book and began to read by lamplight, her voice steady and her hands sure, no longer running from the past, but walking deliberately into a future she was writing one word, one lesson, one rescued girl at a time.